What's up, guys? Listen, I want to share the message with you tonight that we talked about in youth group. We really hate that you weren't able to be there with us, or maybe you're going back and need a refresher on what we talked about. So I want to share with you tonight about this idea of atypical families. Last week in youth group, what we identified is that there are no perfect families. All families are dysfunctional at some level. All families have problems. All families have issues, disagreements, fuss, complicated relationship dynamics. Everybody's family has that in common. So that doesn't make us atypical. That actually makes us typical families. Typical families are families that have dysfunction and problems in them. An atypical family is a family that, in spite of those problems and issues, are able to work through that and do something well, do something good. Now, what I've learned and what we've been talking about is that those families, those atypical families, are families who learn to rely on God and invite God into the midst of their family dynamics. Whether it's the bad stuff, the crazy stuff, the ugly stuff, to invite God into the middle of that. And God, in spite of their dysfunction, in spite of their craziness, God will use them for His glory. So, when's the last time you had a fight with a family member? Some of you are like, hey, this week. Some of you said yesterday. And I bet a lot of you can say today. The reason this is true is because we've been trapped in the house with people. Even though we love them, they get on our nerves. We lose our patience. Things go through the roof, and a lot of times we become bored, and our family becomes a great opportunity to take out our frustration on. So we have these dynamics going on because of our social distancing measures and the COVID-19 and things like that. And I think it's been a challenging season. So here's what I want you to know, is that your family, if you see dysfunction, you see crazy, you're not hopeless. God can still use you. All right, but there's a secret to how you'll allow God in. You got to invite Him into your family's mess. And you got to be someone who steps up and is willing to be atypical so that your family can be an atypical family. So we looked at tonight Abraham. Abraham is a guy in the Bible who is very, very important. He is the father of the faith for Jews, for Christians, and for Muslims. So some of the largest religions in the world, 3 of the largest, look back and trace their faith lineage back to Abraham. He's a pretty important guy. That's a lot of people. God used him in incredible ways. God did incredible things in Abraham's life. He single-handed said, Abraham, I want you. You're going to be the dude that I use to create a nation, to create a people, so that the whole world will know who I am. I'm using you, Abraham. Dude, this guy must be an all-star. He must be an amazing person. Now, Abraham was pretty amazing, but here's what I've learned. If you go read Genesis, chapter 12 through 50, you will see this as well. Abraham was dysfunctional. He had problems. His family had problems. All this craziness that's going on in his family. But in spite of all that, Abraham was atypical. Why? Because he allowed God into his problems. He allowed God into his dysfunction. And God used Abraham in incredible ways. In spite of all the dysfunction of his family and the craziness and all the things that went on in his life, God used him. Because Abraham allowed God in. He invited God in. He was a humble man. All right, so if we look at, I think it's Genesis 13 is where we're going to be at. We're going to see a few things, okay? Before we go there, I want you to remember this. This is one of the points that I want you to know tonight. No family is too simple. No family is too complex for God to use. Your family can be used by God to do atypical things in this world. And we're going to look at Abraham's life, and I want to show you some things to prove that Abraham is one of the most significant people who ever walked the face of the earth, who was not perfect, neither was his family, but God did incredible things through him. Let's watch, or not watch, you're kind of watching me, but let's look and see what happens here. So, if you're not familiar with the story of Abraham, Abraham was a pretty wealthy guy. He had a lot of popularity, a lot of prestige in the place of Ur, where he was from. He had position. He had wealth. He had possessions. He had it good. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't some peasant guy or anything like that. He wasn't on welfare. Like, he was pretty well off. God called Abraham to leave everything, to just walk away from it. God called him to leave and walk away from it and said, I will show you where to go. And Abraham, it says this, in the scripture, it says that Abraham was a righteous man because he believed God. He trusted God. That's the faith. That's the foundation of what Christianity is built on, is that type of faith. Trusting God in the in-between. Here's where we were. Here's where we're going. We don't know how we're going to get there. We don't know when we're going to get there. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what it's going to be like. But we know that this distance here is where God wants us to walk in faith. There's a pretty popular saying in Christianity. It says, walk by faith, not by sight. Jeremy Camp, artist back in the day, wrote a great song about this. Go check it out. I walk by faith, Jeremy Camp. All right. Jeremy, if you watch this message, just send me a free CD or something. I appreciate it. God gave Abraham a promise, and actually it was a threefold promise. He told Abraham, he said, listen, I'm going to bless you. So God gave him a promise that he would bless him. He would, wherever Abraham went, whatever he did, God was going to bless him. He was going to protect him. He was going to restore him. He was going to give him position. He was going to give him favor. He was going to give him protection. I think I already said protection. But anyways, he's going to bless him. Like, Abraham's going to prosper. That doesn't just mean materialistically, but in all ways of life. His crops, his animals, all these types of things, Abraham would prosper because God's blessing was on him. Now, this is not some wealth and preaching kind of, what's the word for that? The prosperity gospel. God's blessing on Abraham was to ensure that the other measures would be taken care of. It's all for God's glory. The second thing that God promised that he would give Abraham is a seed. Abraham didn't have his son. He didn't have, even if God blessed him with everything, he had nobody to give it to. So how would God, why would God bless him? And he's like, I don't have anybody. I got to give it to my servants or my, whoever around me, my neighbors, which is not a bad thing. But Abraham desired a seed, and God's plan for Abraham also revealed that he would have a seed. God promised Abraham that he would give him a son, the promised son. He would give him a son, and not only would he give him a son, but his son would be a father of many nations. Abraham would, his lineage would turn into many nations, a nation, many nations. And it's incredible when you think about this, that there's this one guy, and from that one guy came the 12 tribes of Israel. From that one guy came all the Jews. From that one guy came this whole other wing of the Muslims in the beginning. Now, obviously, not everybody who says they're a Jew today, not everybody who says they're a Muslim today can trace their biological lineage back to Abraham, but some people can. All right, so that's pretty fascinating when you think about that. The third thing that God promised, or the third part of that promise, was that God would give him a land, the promised land, right? The promised land. We know that as Israel today, Jerusalem. And so God gave him that, and he said, I will give it to you forever, that you would possess this land forever. So Abraham and Abraham's descendants would have this land as part of God's promises to Abraham. All right, so he's a pretty incredible guy. Like, he's fascinating. This is phenomenal. He's like one of the heavyweights of the Bible. But here's what I want you to understand. He wasn't perfect. In fact, Abraham had a nephew named Lot. You read about it in Genesis 13. Abraham and Lot were both herdsmen. They owned animals. People worked for them, under them to take care of their herds, and they inhabited the same general area. And there was just strife that happened between them. Abraham and Lot would then, get in fusses or arguments, or there would be tension between them, between the herdsmen, about who's going to graze their animal here, who's going to water the animal here. It just became conflict, and the conflict got so bad that they kind of resolved the conflict by agreeing to live in opposite cities. So I want you to think about this. Here's this guy, Abraham, used by God in incredible ways, was a man after God's heart. God used him, God loved him, God blessed him, but yet in this moment, in this time, he can't get along with his his nephew Lot. And the problem is so bad, dysfunction, whatever they're fussing or fighting is so crazy that they actually have to live in separate cities. So let me read this passage for you so you know where I'm coming from. Genesis 13, 8 through 12 says this. So Abraham said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. We're brothers. Like we're tight, man. We're together. We're family, right? Look on. That's what he says. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Lot looked up and saw the whole plain of Jordan was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt towards Zorah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, all right, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now, if you're familiar with biblical texts, you know Sodom, Gomorrah, not a good place to be. So here's some crazy things that happened, okay? So they had some quarreling. Abraham's like, look, we're brothers, man. We don't need to be fighting like this. Let's just, you go left, I'll go right, or if you go right, I'll go left. Let's just go our different, separate ways. Isn't this what we do in our homes? We're sitting downstairs as a family. Your mom said something that gets on your nerves. What do? We go away. We'll go upstairs. We'll go to our bedroom. We'll go outside. We'll gotta get out of the house. I've said that as a husband. I gotta get out of the house. We go our separate ways. Why? Because there's tension. There's strife. There's dissension. There's, I don't know, like just anger is brewing inside of us, right? So you had to get away from, there's dysfunction. We're dysfunctional people in that way. So Abraham had to live in different cities. It just fascinates me. Not only did they live in different cities, Lot stuck it to Abraham, man. When Abraham said, pick which one you want, Lot chose the better side. He chose the Jordan Plains. And he describes it. He says they were like the Garden of Eden. The water, it was like Egypt, is plentiful. And he says, Abraham, you can have like this desert side of Canaan over here. Kind of stuck it to him a little bit. But here's what I want you to know. Abraham prayed for Lot. When the time came and Lot was in danger, Abraham had an opportunity where he could be like, I could get rid of Lot and I wouldn't have a lot of problems. Get it? Yeah, I hope you got that. I wouldn't have a lot of problems. I could get rid of him. I could get rid of all that issue and I wouldn't have to worry about it no more. But that's not what Abraham did. In Genesis 18, God sends 3 messengers to Abraham. Those messengers come to Abraham to say, hey, look, this promised son that God has promised you, well, your wife's pregnant. She's very old, but she's pregnant. She's going to have a child. It's almost like the announcing of the birth of Christ when Mary was told by the angel, you will conceive and have a child and you will name him Jesus. Abraham has that kind of experience. These 3 heavenly hosts, or these 3 people came and told him, look, your wife's pregnant. But they also, through that conversation, and he was in conversation with God as well, Abraham learned that God was about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness. So instead of Abraham saying, here's an opportunity, I'm going to get rid of Lot. Or he could have said, you know what? If Lot wants to live, he better come and apologize. He better come to me crawling on his knees like a little baby whining and come to me and apologize, or he's going down, baby. He's going down. That wasn't Abraham's attitude. Abraham was conflicted. He was devastated. He was in pain, in anguish over the idea that Lot would be wiped off the face of the earth. So he goes to God and he cries out to God. This is what he says. Abraham approached God and he said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous like they are wicked. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? The Lord said, If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. So Abraham goes to God and he begs, he prays on behalf of Lot. Now his intention to save Sodom is to save Lot. He says, if there's 50, and God says, if there's 50, I'll save it. Then Abraham says, well, hey, God, well, actually, if there's 45, surely you won't let it go because there's missing, there's 45 people, but not 50. God says, if there's 45, and he keeps doing that until he gets down to the number 10. And when he gets down to the number 10, he says this, then he said, verse 32, then he said, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there? He answered, for the sake of the 10, I will not destroy it. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left and Abraham returned home. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah do get destroyed because Abraham could not find 10 people. In fact, the only persons that were rescued from that situation was Lot and his family. But I want you to understand this, is that Lot and his family would have lost their life if it had not been for Abraham going to God and saying, God, will you spare them? He went to God. He was atypical in this, is that he was the first to step up and do something about a problem. He didn't just stand back and watch it happen. Can you imagine Abraham standing on the hill, watching the hellfire, brimstone, all this kind of stuff blow up the city where his nephew Lot lived, and say, that's what you get, Lot. Shouldn't be double crossing me. You thought you took the best land? What about now? Huh? How good's that land now, Lot? Huh? Ha, that's what I thought. No, man, see, God doesn't want us to be revengeful in that way. Abraham and Lot had a long history of disagreement. They couldn't even live in the same city, but when Abraham learned God was going to destroy Sodom, he cried out to God. Abraham made a choice. He pleaded with God on Lot's behalf. And in response to Abraham's prayer, God spared. He spared him. Here's the third thing I want you to know. If you want God to use your family to do atypical things, sometimes you have to be the first person to do something atypical. What that means is don't be the type of person to wait around on other family members to make things right. You be the person who rises to the occasion first. Step up, do the right thing, make things right, seek forgiveness, deal with the problems you're having. Don't be a bystander and watch the calamity, the destruction of the relationships in your life that should mean the most to you. Be the first person to make a move. That will make you atypical. The only way you can do that is to swallow your pride and allow God to work in you and through you to do that. Many times we focus on living our faith out for others to see. We think about that. Hey, at your workplace, make sure you're living like Christ. When you go out in public, make sure you're living like Christ. When you go to church, make sure you're Christ-like in your attitude, your thoughts, your actions, your speech. When you go to school, make sure you're living like Christ. When you're playing sports, make sure you possess the Christ-like character that you should have. Here's what we forget, is that we first got to live like Christ with our own family. I personally think this can be the hardest at times, but it should be the first place, at home, with our family, whether it's our mom, our dad, our brother, sister, husband's wife, whatever. There, we first should love, serve unconditionally, and be like Christ in that environment. Here's why it's hard. It's because at home, people know who we really are. We're not putting on a facade. I've called it my safe place, right? I can have a bad attitude. I can be grumpy, and things of that nature. And I can pout. I can throw myself a pity party at home. And the people I'm around are familiar with that. It's easier for me to fall back into that mindset, to have a bad attitude, right? But here's the thing that I have to challenge myself with, and I want to challenge you with, is that we first should live for Christ at home, and then we should live for Him in public. And that doesn't mean, just forget the public. They can do whatever. What it means is that living for Christ at home should be very, very important to us. We should give ourselves a test. Put our faith to the test. Do we look like Christ at home? Does Christ make a difference in our life at home? When our family, are we forgiving our family? Are we loving our family? Are we serving our family? Or are we putting ourselves first? Are we selfish at home? Those are honest questions that we need to ask ourselves. Paul gives some practical advice to believers, addressing the church of Rome and Ephesus in the book of Romans and Ephesians. And this is what he says. I love this, okay? Paul talks about this sincere love. So let me read this. This is Romans 12, 9 and 10. He says, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil and cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. Paul tells the believers here, he says, guys, your love has got to be sincere. Hate evil, cling to good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. Sometimes we read that and we think about external relationships, like outside of our family unit. But we also have to remember that this is also true for us at home. We have to love at home like this as well. He further goes on to Ephesians and he kind of gives some different things, and he really challenges the believers in Ephesus to change their attitude. And I want you to really listen to what he says here. This is pretty fascinating. Ephesians 4:21. He says, surely you heard of him and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds. It's really important. And to put on your new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood, speak truthfully to his neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. So here Paul is giving some pretty incredible instructions and encouragement. He says, listen, in Christ, you have been made into a new creation. Now, I think this is really, really interesting. He says, in regard to your former way of life, put off. It's like this idea of a shirt or jacket. You wake up in the morning, you get dressed. You don't go to your closet and your clothes jump on your body. You reach inside your closet or your drawer, you out your shirt, you take out your pants, you put them on. It's a decision. It's a choice. You put it on. He's telling us as believers that you have to put on this new mind. You have to put on the newness of Christ. Put on what Jesus is doing. The humility. You put on humility. 1 Peter tells us to clothe yourself with humility. The act of that is not like this, I wish I could be humble. I wish I could be like Jesus. I wish I could take off this old self. How do you take off the old self and put on the new self? It's intentionally making decisions. Well, what kind of decisions? He tells us. He says, be made new in the attitude of your minds. Change your minds. Romans 12, verse 1 and 2. Verse 2 actually says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed. How are we transformed? By renewing our minds. He goes on to say this in verse 29. He says, don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is helpful for building up of others to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Whatever we say, whatever we do, whatever comes out of our mouths, Jesus said that from the heart one speaks. Our heart is the fountain of our mouth. So when the things out of our mouth are not right, that is a reflection that our heart is not right. When we go off and we scream and we yell, we cuss, or we just talk down to people, put people down, it's a reflection of the attitude of our heart. So we have to be willing to restrain that. We have to be willing to change that. He tells us in verse 31, get rid of all bitterness, rage, brawling, and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another. Forgive each other just as Christ, God, forgave you. So what does this mean? If you want your family to be atypical, then you got to take a step, friend. You got to be atypical. And you can lead the way in your family. See, Abraham was the leader. He stepped up. He prayed to God. He asked God, he begged God to have mercy on Sodom, on those who were righteous. Lot and his family were the only ones that were spared, but they were spared. We have a lot of dysfunction in our families. That doesn't disqualify us for being used by God. What disqualifies us is when we try to handle our own dysfunction, or we try to ignore our dysfunction. See, if we would just be willing to invite God into our dysfunction, to invite God into our mess, to invite God into our problems in our life, in our family, God will still use it. God will work in your life. He will use you. He will use your family for His glory if you invite Him in. So be atypical this week. Invite God into the drama, to the issues, to the problems of your life and your family, and watch Him do incredible things. We love you guys. Hope you have a great night. Be blessed. God loves you. We love you. Peace.